Hey, my name is Matiss. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cream Finance, and this is what I do. I'll start by saying that I was given this specific topic to cover, which says the focus on subprime credit markets and prospects for growth. And the first time I read this title very quickly, I thought, this is fucking amazing, right? I'm going to talk about these amazing companies that we have in our space. They're growing so fast, especially in places like Southeast Asia and Latin America. But then I read it more carefully, and I realized that there's this ugly word, European, in the title, which meant that probably for the next 20, 30 minutes, I'll be talking about competition, cutthroat competition, a lot of regulatory pressure, and little growth. Yeah? But nevertheless, in Cream Finance, we're kind of used to dealing with such adverse environment. So I'll probably share kind of some of our experiences from Cream Finance, and I'll talk about some of the key markets and kind of how we see them. In this slide, I'll give you just a few higher level points about kind of where we come from as a company. So we started in 2012 in a small country called Latvia. Now we operate around 8 countries in the world. We are based, our central office is based in Poland, in Warsaw. We employ over 300 people. Last year we reached a revenue of over 30 million. The most important point that I'd like to point out in this fintech space is that we're profitable, but just as quite a few other companies in our space are. We raised close to 100 million in capital, both private and public markets. Just this year, we announced an equity raise from a leading retail bank in South Africa. And the reason why I'm mentioning that we've raised this money is not because I think it's really important, but because of a lot of people in business and in the media thinking that raising money is more important than actually building a profitable business, which I think is quite a stupid trend, but it's so overwhelming and everybody talks about it, so I had to stick with it and just mention that we also raised a ton of money. So again, talking about regulation a little bit. So this, I was trying to kind of put a lot of information in this slide. So what it does is, on the bottom, you see a heat map showing more severe regulation with red, and the most severe is rate caps, right? They can be very high, but most of the times they're quite low and cut into the pricing. So that you could consider to be a severe regulation. More to things like milder regulation, like marketing restrictions, underwriting restrictions, licensing requirements, capital requirements, and then eventually no regulation. So what I'm doing here is I'm mapping out these different categories of regulation across all the different key countries. Yeah? And it's not easy to do because regulation can be different. The same category can be slightly different in different countries and so on. But roughly, this gives you an idea where, again, Latvia, UK regulated across most of the categories of the different types of regulation. Finland, also the same thing. Sweden is already becoming less regulated without the rate caps for subprime loans. Poland, there's a little kind of regulation, but there's, for example, a rate cap. And then, again, as I mentioned, to less regulated countries, particularly Spain, which has pretty much no regulation or very little regulation at this stage. So one point which is good to remember is that even though you have these different levels of regulation, you can still do business in these countries. That's the good news. Even with the rate caps, even with all sorts of other requirements. Yeah? The other point is, if you would map this out, which I haven't done, but if you would map this table out for the next few years, looking at the past, what happens is it gets more and more filled out. So literally, I would bet that in the next 2 to 3 years, you will see all the types of regulation in every single country on this table. Yeah? So regulation just keeps coming in, it keeps evolving and effectively getting a bit more severe over time. I want to raise a few points about regulation from our experience because regulation is really one of the key driving forces. Once and if a particular country in a market gets big enough, then the regulation starts becoming one of the driving forces. It's no longer only the competition. Regulation with some set rate caps, it becomes one of the key driving kind of elements in the market. One important thing to think about is what are the kind of driving forces behind regulation? Because it's not, obviously it's a fairy tale to think about it's just about consumer protection. It's obviously not like that. Yeah? So one thing that drives how quickly the regulation comes in and how it evolves is the growth speed of the credit market itself. The faster it grows, the faster it's going to invite regulation to come into the market. That's quite simple and obvious. Second point is dominance of individual companies. Yeah? By dominance, I mean if any particular company in our space owns more than 30%, and we know these companies in different markets, it will for sure start favoring regulation in a specific direction that favors that one dominant company, right? So that's always very important to observe. If you have a monopolistic kind of situation in the market, you know that the regulatory kind of drive will probably be coming from that particular company. Or at least that one particular company will try to push forward regulation that favors that company. The third point is interest or presence of special interest groups. These are oftentimes government ministries. This can be association of banks or a group of non-bank players or some other interested groups. And if you have these interested groups in the market, again, those groups will push and promote regulation in a direction that really favors this particular group. It can be a group of only big companies, for example, so that smaller companies would die out. But understanding these three kind of dynamics are, I think, pretty important to have no illusions about where regulation comes from. All right. And the next important question to ask as a result of the previous slide is kind of what's a good example or what's the best ideal balance when it comes to regulation? Yeah? And I think what's the best balance not only from kind of like lender's perspective, but most importantly from consumer's perspective. Yeah? And I think from our experience, a regulation that is in a fair amount towards the lender and the borrower is the best for the market over time in the long term. UK, a lot of smart people in the UK, I think they've come up with a fairly good proxy to what is a very balanced regulation for subprime credit. And I'll explain why I think so. So first and foremost, consumers are protected. Yeah? There's clear kind of regulatory framework within which the companies that do subprime credit operate in the UK. There's no abusive sort of situations and products on the market, so consumers are protected. That's number one. Second, both small and large companies can coexist, I think, which is very important. It's not like regulation kicks in and there's like 4 big companies left that each own like 25% or something. Yeah? Both small and large companies coexist. Lenders can make money. So if you look at the P&Ls, which is possible of the subprime lenders in the UK, you can see that both the small and the large companies are making money. Yeah? Very important. I think it's very important. It doesn't, the regulation doesn't kill the business. Yeah? And of course, for the regulator, there's a very good market oversight. Yeah? Just kicking in rate caps doesn't mean that you regulate the market. Yeah? It means that you distort it. Through licensing, through capital requirements, through information disclosure requirements, regulators can get a good sense of whether the market is being actually regulated, if the companies comply, if it's going into the right direction, which is the case in the UK. And then as the last point, nothing to do with the UK, but in any case, industry representatives like us, we have the responsibility to take a proactive kind of stance always when it comes to regulation, because otherwise somebody else will do it for us. So whether it's in the form of associations, which is the common way to do it, or through conferences, it's always important we ourselves first set the agenda for where we want the regulation to be. I think that's pretty much it. I don't know if you ask questions or not, or yeah. So thank you guys for your attention.